All right, so we've chosen our topic. We've reviewed the literature on that topic to identify what previous scholars have already researched in this area, and we've identified a gap, something that nobody seems to have studied before that we can contribute by furthering the knowledge in our discipline. Next thing we need to do is formulate a hypothesis or research question. So what's the difference between the two? Well, research questions typically are exploratory, meaning that they're open-ended questions that could produce a number of outcomes, right? So these are typically what, why, how questions that are, again, exploratory and open-ended. Hypotheses, on the other hand, are predictive statements. They are informed statements that set out to prove or disprove something. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples here so we can see the difference between the two. Try and identify whether each of the following is a research question or a hypothesis. Okay, so A states, how do children raised by single fathers perform in school? Do you think that this is a research question or a hypothesis? How do children raised by single fathers perform in school? So look at the definitions of research question and hypothesis here. Which one seems to be a better fit for A? The correct answer is research question. So again, research questions are open-ended, meaning that they are not yes or no questions. They are exploratory in nature, right? How do children raised by single fathers perform in school? There's several possible answers to this question that could be uncovered, right? So how about B? Children with single fathers will perform better in school than children with single mothers. Research question or hypothesis? The correct answer is a hypothesis. So unlike our research question up here, hypotheses are not formed as questions, they are statements, and they are statements that we could collect data on and prove or disprove. They could be found to be true or false, right? So children with single fathers will perform better in school than children with single mothers. This hypothesis is predicting that a child with a single father will have a better educational outcome than a child with a single mother. It is a statement that we can either prove or disprove that can be found to be true or false, right? So research questions, again, open-ended and exploratory in nature, typically how, why, or what questions. Hypotheses are statements that are written out, and then we either prove them or disprove them by collecting and analyzing data. So what are some components of a hypothesis? Let's talk a little bit more about this. Hypothesis states a predicted relationship, typically between two different variables. So a variable is any object, idea, or behavior that can be controlled, changed, or measured. Okay? So examples of variables that we're often interested in studying in sociology include gender, race, age, income, level of education, religious beliefs, marital status, numbers of hours spent on Facebook each week, stance on abortion, etc., etc. There are millions of variables that we could be interested in looking at. So another way to think of the variables are basically the aspects of human behavior or human attitudes that you're interested in studying, the aspects of humans that you're interested in researching and developing further knowledge on. Okay. Typically, we talk about two different types of variables. In a hypothesis, you are always going to have an independent variable and a dependent variable. So independent variables are those that are predicted to cause a change in other variables, and they remain unaffected by other variables. Okay, so independent variables, think about that. If something's independent, it stands on its own, right? It's independent. Those are the variables that we predict are not going to be influenced or changed, but we expect that they are going to cause change in other variables, right? Gender, race, socioeconomic status, age, those are all typically independent variables, right? We wouldn't expect a certain variable to cause someone's race to change, right? Race typically is not going to be something that changes for an individual, but someone's race might predict or might cause a change in another behavior or attitude that they have. Dependent variables, on the flip side, are those variables that are predicted to experience a change as a result of the independent variable. So we expect our dependent variables to fluctuate or to vary based off of different levels of an independent variable. So this probably sounds very confusing, but we'll take a look at some hypotheses here as some examples so we can see what independent and dependent variables look like. Okay, so this first hypothesis: the older a person is, the more likely they will have a pro-life stance towards abortion. Okay? The older the person is, the more likely they will have a pro-life stance towards abortion. So what are the two variables in this hypothesis? Don't worry about independent or dependent yet. Just what are the two variables, the two objects or ideas about humans that we are analyzing in this hypothesis? What do you think? So the first variable we're working with is a person's age, right? The older a person is, so we're talking about an individual's age. And the second variable is attitudes about abortion, right? So the two variables we're working with this hypothesis are age and attitudes about abortion. Now, which one of those variables would you think is the independent variable, meaning that it is the variable that is not expected to change itself, but is expected to have an influence on the other variable? So does it make more sense that a person's age would affect their attitudes about abortion, or that a person's attitudes about abortion would affect their age? Think about that. So in this instance, the independent variable is going to be age, right? We wouldn't expect a person's age to vary or fluctuate depending on their attitudes about abortion, but we may expect that a person's age, the older or younger a person is, could likely predict their stance on abortion, right? In this particular hypothesis, we're anticipating that an older person, so a person with a higher value or a higher age, would more likely have a pro-life stance towards abortion in comparison to people who are younger. Let's look at a few more examples here. Being in a fraternity or a sorority will result in higher alcohol consumption. So what are the variables we're working with in this hypothesis? Being in a fraternity or sorority will result in higher alcohol consumption. Well, the first variable looks like that we're working with is being in Greek life in some capacity, right? Being in a fraternity or sorority. The second variable would be alcohol consumption. So what makes sense here? Which of these variables would be the independent variable? The variable that we are predicting is going to cause a change in the dependent variable. Well, in this example, fraternity or sorority status. So being involved in Greek life, we're expecting is going to result in higher amounts of alcohol consumption, which would be our dependent variable. And this last example, the safest schools will be those with most security guards present. So let's start off by first identifying the variables in this hypothesis. The safest schools will be those with the most security guards present. Our two variables that we're working with here would be school safety, the safeness of the school, and the presence of security guards. So how many security guards a school has. Now, which of these variables would be the independent variable? The variable that we are expecting would cause a change in the other variable. So in this example, it would be security guards. The higher number of security guards present, we are predicting, would result in a more safe school. So this one might have tricked you a little bit, because in these first two examples, the independent variable was listed first and the dependent variable was listed second. But as you see in this third example of a hypothesis, it's not always that case. So you really need to pay attention when you're reading hypotheses and ask yourself, all right, which of these variables am I expecting is not going to be influenced or changed by other variables, but will cause a change in others? That would be your independent variable. And then which variable am I expecting is going to fluctuate or vary depending on the presence or absence of the independent variable? And that would be your dependent variable. A little confusing, a little tricky, I know, but with more practice, this does get easier. So let's talk about things to consider when developing a research question, right? So again, hypotheses are the predictive statements that can be proven or disproven. Research questions are open-ended and exploratory. So we often will use research questions for studies when maybe we don't know a whole lot about what's been previously found. Maybe there aren't a lot of scholarly sources published on a particular topic, or there's a pretty big gap. So we can't maybe articulate hypotheses because we don't have enough information to make those educated guesses. So we might need a more exploratory approach to our research. So things to consider: what exactly do you want to explore? Research questions and hypotheses, for that matter, should address specific topics that we're actually capable of measuring, right? So this is important. Again, to be a sociological study, it needs to be focused on human interactions, patterns of human behavior, etc. We're not asking philosophical questions like, what makes men better than women? Right? Things like that. Those aren't questions that we can actually answer. So we need to be sure that the questions, research questions or hypotheses we're developing, are things that we can actually collect empirical evidence on so we can analyze that data and articulate some informed answers. Should always try to frame your research question or hypothesis within the literature and or theory that you're building on, questioning, or contributing to. Again, that's why the reviewing pre-existing sources, scholarly sources, is such an important component of the research process because it helps us understand what's already been found, right? When we're doing science, we typically are trying to build upon previously found previous findings or previous scholarly sources. We want to retest them, right? Reliability. Make sure that the findings that were produced maybe 5-10 years ago are still valid today because society is continuously changing. Or maybe there's a study and the methods we think are a little wishy-washy, so we want to retest that study to make sure that those methods really hold their weight. So it's important to know what other scholars have previously researched, excuse me, before you conduct your own study and develop your own research question. So let's talk about designing a study. We got our research question. We know what gap in the literature we're trying to address. How do we go about developing a study? Well, the first thing we need to consider is the population. What group of people, events, or things are we interested in studying and saying something about? The who or what you want to be able to say something about at the end of your study, right, excuse me, is the population. Examples of populations could be people raised by single mothers, incarcerated people, etc. So if my research is interested in better understanding the experiences of single mothers, the population, the group of people that I'm trying to say something about would be single mothers. An entire population is often too large to study within a particular research project, right? There's no way I could conduct a study examining the attitudes or behaviors of every single mother that is currently living, right? There's too many. It'd be impossible to collect all of those people. How would I find access to every single mother? So, since we can't always access every member of the population that we're interested in studying, we try to target a specific sample. So a sample refers to a manageable number of subjects who represent a larger population. So examples, if I wanted to do a project on single mothers, but I couldn't access every single mother, perhaps I wanted to just focus on students in the Corpus Christi Independent School District that are raised by single mothers. Same thing, if I was interested in conducting a study and my population of interest was incarcerated people, I'm not going to be able to talk to every single incarcerated person in the United States, but maybe I could focus my sample on just inmates at the Federal Detention Center in Houston, Texas, right? So samples are just smaller, more manageable groups or subsets of the populations that we're interested in studying. And it makes it easier, more accessible for us as research to target a sample versus targeting an entire population. So let's go back to this hypothesis that we worked with earlier. Being a member of a fraternity or a sorority will result in higher alcohol consumption. What is the population of interest in this hypothesis? So what is the large group of people that I'm interested in saying something about in this particular hypothesis? The answer would be college students in a fraternity or sorority, right? That's the large group of people that my research is trying to say something about. We want to understand how being involved in Greek life, if you're a college student, may or may not affect the amount of alcohol you consume. So since it would not be feasible for me to examine alcohol consumption for every person currently in the population of fraternity members, how might we define a target sample that represents the larger population, right? So I'm not going to be able to survey every single college student, determine if they're in a fraternity or sorority, and ask them how much they drink, right? There's way too many college students in the US. So what might be a more manageable representation for a sample for this project? Well, perhaps I could study the alcohol consumption of fraternity and sorority members here at TAMU-CC. That is a far smaller subgroup of the population. It's more manageable, more easier for me as a researcher to access. So it might be a good alternative instead of trying to reach out to every single college student living in the US. Let's talk a little bit about ethics. Actually, I'll pause this video here and we'll pick up on this next time.